Today's pattern is a really adorable little bridesmaid's dress. It's Simplicity 4647 and you've got different views to make. I like the fact that you can have a sash or you can just have a ribbon tie, so you can make it look different depending on the special occasion. I'm going to show a few of the techniques that you're going to use. One is an invisible zip, which the pattern doesn't call for, but I really do prefer them to regular zip insertions. And the other is a quick method of gathering fabrics. And I'll give you some tips on sewing with silky fabrics. When you're making clothes, whether it's for yourself or for children, do go by the measurements of your person that you're making for, not just by the size. On children's patterns, the sizes are basically size stroke age, but of course children grow at different rates. So check the measurements against the pattern and against the child, and then make the size that corresponds most closely to those measurements. And the beauty of sewing with a Simplicity pattern like this, which has got multi-sizes, is if the chest size it doesn't correspond to the same waist size, you can cut from one line to another. I'll show you what I mean. So the first step, having checked which ones I need, is to cut the pieces out roughly. When I lay this onto the fabric and cut out the fabric, then I'll cut carefully around the right line. Now, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to be working on just this small piece, but I just want to show you a couple of key things. On the pattern piece, there are lots of different markings, and it's really important that you follow them, particularly the grain line. On this piece here, it says centre fold, place on fold. And you can always tell that because it's a straight arrow with two right-angled arrowheads. So that I've placed on the fold. And I've also folded the fabric right sides together. This piece has got a grain line, straight line with two arrowheads. That grain line must be parallel to the selvage, and the selvage is the bound edge. It's really important that it's perfectly parallel along the whole length. This is a little short one, but obviously if you're doing a big piece, it'd be a long line. So I measure from the grain line to the edge of the fabric. So I'm measuring there, that's 8 centimetres. Just pin that in place. And then measure the other end and make sure it's 8 centimetres still and pin it in place. Now the reason that's really important is a fabric has more stretch on the bias, and the bias is sort of a 45-degree angle to the selvage edge. So if I pull the fabric like that, you can see there's hardly any give at all. The same that way, which is on the straight grain. But if I pull it at an angle, you can see how it stretches. So when you need to lay a piece with that straight grain, and you don't, you lay it off, when you try and stitch it, you'll get twisted seams, or one end will sag. So that's why it's very important. So having pinned the pieces on, now I'm going to cut to the size 5, or age 5, which is along this line. So I'm keeping my pins inside, and then they're ready to cut out. Now I cut nice and neatly along the cutting line. Now the notches, I cut out around the notches. And again, this is very important. These notches are used to match fronts to back, sides to side, etc. If you cut into the fabric, which is into the seam allowance, and for any reason that you need to expand the garment a little because it's a bit snug or something, you won't be able to because you've cut a notch. So always cut them outwards. So I'm following that line around. And you'll find on Simplicity patterns and New Look patterns that the notches are, generally speaking, single for the front of the garment, double for the back. So that's quite a nice thing to know when you're going to set in sleeves. It helps make sure you put the right sleeve in the right armhole, because the double notches will be on the back, the singles on the front. Having cut the pieces out, I want to transfer the markings from the pattern onto the fabric. So I'm just going to lift that up, pop a pin through, and then I can use a marking pen or a chalk pencil just to mark the fabric. So make sure you mark both sides, so that's both pieces, because here I've cut 2 pieces because it's told me to cut 2. So that's the other thing about these pieces. It tells you what piece you're cutting, what view it's for, how many you need to cut. And if I also needed to cut it in interfacing or in lining, it would tell me that too, as it does on this one. It tells me to cut it in lining as well as in fabric. So all this information is here on the tissue. The other thing that's quite interesting is the tissue also tells you the size of the bust or the chest here. So all the information is there for you. As soon as you've cut it out, take the pins out, particularly when you're working with a silky fabric. And if possible, do only pin in the seam allowance to make sure you don't leave any holes. I'm going to do the outer edge on the little sleeves, and the pattern calls for a very, very narrow hem. So I'm turning under just over 1/8 of an inch, and again it's a 3/8 of an inch hem, and then I'm going to pin it in place. You've got to be very careful when you're pinning a silky fabric. Make sure you're using very sharp, nice new pins. Now, if you're worried about doing this, the pattern does tell you the alternative would be to cut 4 pieces, so 2 for each sleeve, sew round the outer edges, so the 2 pieces together, right sides together, and turn them through, so you've effectively lined your sleeves. And that is an easier way of doing it if you're struggling with turning under such a small amount and getting that under the sewing machine. I'm going to stay stitch around the neck edges of the bodice pieces. Now, stay stitching is a row of regular stitch length just inside the seam allowance, and you do it to prevent curved areas stretching out of shape. Because if I very gently, I don't want to stretch it out of shape, but if I very gently pull on this, you can see, because that's a curved area, the fabric can stretch. Now that could stretch out of shape whilst I'm handling it and putting the pieces together if I didn't stay stitch. So regular stitch length, just inside the seam allowance. So I'm just going to move the needle over just a little bit so that I'm inside the seam allowance, and this stitching therefore remains. I haven't got to worry about fixing the stitch at either end because it's just temporary stitching, although it doesn't come out. It's not holding the seam together. It's going to prevent these pieces from stretching. And I do this on all of the neck edge pieces. So this is the front, and there'll be 2 back pieces because of course there's a zip to go in, so I need 2 back sections. And that now will prevent it stretching out of shape. If you can see, I can pull it and it's not stretching out of shape. And then I won't get a baggy neckline once I stitch it all together. I'm going to gather the top of the skirt edges. Now on this pattern there are 3 quite wide panels, and you stitch them all together lengthwise before you gather around the top, and therefore there's a lot to gather. So the best way to gather that without the threads breaking when you're pulling them up is to compartmentalise it into 3 sections. I'll just show you on one of the sections. So I'm going to start, again it's just within the seam allowance, using the longest stitch length I've got. And you can do 1 or 2 rows of gathering stitches, and then when I get to the end, I'm going to leave a thread tail. I'm going to use the bobbin thread to pull up. So I pull on the bobbin thread and just ease the gathers along. And for now, all I need to do is loosely gather it, because what I'm going to do is fit this to the bodice later, and when I fit it, it's then that you sort of fine the gathers to make sure it fits. And the idea of gathering is you fit the fuller edge onto a straight edge. So again, using the bobbin thread to pull it up and just even out those gathers, and then that piece would be ready. But as I said, on the actual pattern there'll be 3 pieces all joined together, so you'll have a big wide piece. I'm now going to put in the invisible zip. Again, I'm working on a sample piece. You actually put the zip in before you sew the rest of the seam, unlike a conventional centred or lap zip. So I have prepared my fabric edges by neatening the raw edges. I've turned under the seam allowance to the wrong side and pressed it, so I've got a nice crease. I'm also going to use an invisible zip foot. And you can tell it's an invisible zip because on the right side, there are no teeth. All you have is the little tab at the end, and the underside is where the teeth are. So I'm now going to show you how to insert it. First thing to do is to fit the foot. So I'm going to release the foot that's already on. You will have a button or a lever on the back of the foot. to release it, and then clip this one in place. This particular foot has a bar at the back to go over the bar at the back, and then clips on at the front. So it's very, very simple to put on. And the next thing to do is, with your garment ready, prepared, I have it sort of ready, and I'm going to place the zip right side down in position so that the teeth are running along that crease on the left edge. So I position my zip at the top so the teeth are in place. Open the zip completely. I can take this piece out of the way for now and pin the zip all the way down so that the teeth are on the crease that I made previously. So this is the right side of the fabric. The zip is on the seam allowance only, and I'm pinning it in place. You can then hand baste or machine baste down the centre of the tape to hold it in place, or you can just go straight to machine stitching. So I've positioned my pinned zip and my fabric piece under the foot so that the teeth are in the right hand side groove under the foot, and then the needle I've moved just a smidgen over to the left so that it's going to stitch virtually under the teeth, because the teeth will sort of roll out as you go along, and you want them to be, the stitching to be nice and close to those teeth. Go quite slowly. And you have to take the pins out before you get to them, because of course I've got them vertically along the stitching line. As I get towards the bottom, you'll see that the foot will get to the actual zip pull, so you can't stitch to the very end of the tape. That's the difference between a regular zip and an invisible zip. So I'm just going to reverse stitch there. That's that one side done. I'm now ready to put the other side in. So I'm going to close the zip. I do this because I want to make sure I put the other side in the right piece the right way round. So I'm going to put my piece up against the first one, lay it on top, make sure it matches, and then I can just pin it in place. Now for starters, I'm going to pin through both layers there. That's just to make sure I have it in the right place. Unzip it again, and then turn this all over so that I can now pin it, as I did before, to the seam allowance only, with the teeth along the crease that I've made. And then I'm going to stitch again. And this time I will have the teeth in the left-hand groove of the underside of the foot. So I'll just forward and back to anchor that in. And now I've got the teeth of this side of the zip going through my left groove. And again, stitching close to those teeth. So the needle's just to the right of them this time. And again, I just get just to the zip pull and back stitch to anchor it in place. And again, that's finished. So the next step is to finish the seam. So again, I'm going to pull the zip up just to double check it. And all you should be able to see, so when that's pressed nicely, all you can see is the little zip pull at the end. So now I'm going to finish the end, because as you could see, I couldn't get to the very end, and of course the end of the seam hasn't been done. So I'm going to fold that over, right sides together, pull that out of the way, and open the seam allowances so that I can pin with the right sides together, pin along the seam line, and then keeping that out of the way, I'm going to pin so that I'm going to start stitching. If you can see there, that's the stitching holding the zip tape in. I'm going to start stitching about 2 to 3 millimeters away, about here. I'm not going to try and join it up perfectly, because when you try to join it perfectly, you end up with a little bump. So come out just literally a couple of millimeters, but a little bit higher, so you're going to overlap a little. So I'm going to pin there. And that's where I'm going to start stitching, keeping the tails out of the way, and stitch down to the bottom of the seam. Now I'm going to put on the regular zip foot, and this one will have a little groove either side of a single toe. So again, I've got a bar, and that bar fits into a groove which is under the foot holder. And I want to make sure I attach it so the foot is furthest away from the zip. Now remember, you might have moved your needle, so before starting to stitch, do make sure that your needle isn't going to fall and hit the foot. So I'm going to move my needle over and line it all up. I've got that pin there to show me where to do it. Pop the pin out because I don't want to try and stitch on the pin. Lower the presser foot and I'm ready to go. Having moved that out of the way, I'm going to stitch on the spot to start with. Let's get that thread out of the way. And then continue down the seam. And the last stage is, because you still have this tail, is to make sure you open it out and you stitch just on the seam allowance. So I'm just going to pop that foot off and put it over to the other side. So again, the foot is further away from the teeth, and I can just stitch that last bit of tail that's not anchored at all down to the seam allowance only. And do the same on the other side. Again, just on the seam allowance, so open that out. Here's our finished dress. So earlier on I gathered the skirt section, so here it is joined to the bodice. So the bodice is straight and the skirt was gathered. And as you can see, there's seams here because there are 3 panels going all the way around. And I've actually done the sash separately. The pattern calls for it to be attached to the bodice, but I actually thought it was quite nice if it was a separate sash, so I could ring the changes and just have a lovely ribbon instead. And on the back, I've got the inserted zip, so this is an invisible zip, so there's no seams, no stitching on the outside. Just need to put a little hook and eye up there. And then here's the bow, which is created according to the pattern. But if I take that bow off, I've actually pinned it in place. Let me unpin. And I've put a popper on to popper it in place. But I can take it off and instead, for instance, have a lovely length of coordinating ribbon, which could then just be tied around your little miss and made into a pretty ribbon tie. And in fact, you could tie the ribbon at the front, at the side, or indeed at the back. So it's another look. So it's a more toned down, but still very pretty little look.